Welcome. This is Sophomore English, and I'm going to talk about two things in a half an hour. At least that's my hope to, anyway. The first of the two things that I want to talk about have to do with ACT. So this is just kind of general ACT types of stuff. All right. So hopefully some of this will make sense to you. The ACT test is a test which tests not intelligence. All right, not intelligence. So for example, a perfect score in the ACT composite is a 36. I once had a student that came in and said, I got a 16, I must be an idiot. Got to understand something. The ACT does not measure intelligence. In other words, if you get a 36, that doesn't mean you're smart. Versus if you don't get a 36, that means you're dumb. Okay, no. For example, I don't care how bright and smart you are. If I give you the ACT, for example, in a different language you don't know, you ain't doing well. Are you hearing what I'm saying? What I am saying is this: the ACT tests your ability to take a test. That's important to understand. It does not test intelligence, it tests your ability to take a test, all right? So with that in mind, let's talk real quickly about kind of what this whole thing of the ACT actually means, all right? It is a 3-hour reading test. It's so important that you understand that. There's nothing more important than what I just said. In other words, when Mr. Soph gives the ACT, he does not wheel in a TV, VCR, DVD unit, and then you get to watch stuff and then respond. Way wrong answer. The entire test, non-stop, 3-hour reading test. So for example, the student who wrote the 16, I said to her, I said, okay, but think about this for a second. When was the last time you read the kind of crap that's on the ACT? It's boring, right? What kind of boring stuff? It's not like reading a novel or something, okay? When was the last time you read that stuff under timed conditions? Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. And when was the last time you read under time conditions with intense amounts of stress? In other words, if I don't get a good score, that's correlated to money, like we'll talk about in a second. There's money involved, blah, blah, blah. All of those things compounded, I could kind of make this example. Imagine, for example, if we all jumped in trucks and went out to the edge of town, and we told Trout, jump out of the truck and start running towards Thermop. And run as hard as you can. So she takes off running. Of course, we wait for a few minutes, drive down to the road half a mile, and there she is asphyxiating in the ditch, right? Okay. Now, we're not saying Trout couldn't run to Thermop. We are saying that for her to run to Thermop, she'd have to practice a long time at running. You got me? The key about the ACT is it's a 3-hour reading test. It is constructed in such a way to break you down mentally. That's what the test is for, which is why if you're going to do well on the ACT, you have to begin to develop certain skill sets because the test measures your ability to take a test. Do you got me? The whole test is reading. So if you're not spending a lot of time learning how to read actively, as we've kind of talked about it in here with annotation, you're going to struggle. Even if you're a good reader, if you haven't done a lot of reading under 3-hour, intense 3 hours. I mean, think about this. The last time you read anything start to finish for 3 hours. I mean, just think about the last time you did that. Most high school juniors, when they take the test for the first time, reading 3 hours, the first time they ever do it is when they take the ACT. So it's got nothing to do with what kind of readers they are. Maybe for the first hour and a half they did pretty well as readers. Through the math section, you're reading. Through the reading section, you're reading. Through the science section, you're reading. All of it's reading. You're not allowed to hear somebody else read it out loud to you. Do you hear me? So what happens is that by the time you get to the back end of the test, you mentally are exhausted. It's designed that way. Okay, the test is designed to fatigue you. Not unlike getting in a pool and just swimming laps. You could do that if you train at it, but if you don't train at it, it will break you down. It doesn't matter how good a swimmer you are. Right? Doesn't matter. Over time, you're going to fatigue. So the first thing I would say is the kind of preparation is huge, all right, in terms of development of several things. Reading comprehension / speed goes along with vocabulary development. So we know those two things kind of go together. Your mathematics practice in terms of doing those math problems so that you don't have to expend a lot of mental energy to solve word problems. If you don't do a lot of that kind of prep work, you struggle, especially in the sciences, learning how to read graphs and all that kind of stuff. All of that's important because we know that if, and research has been done to prove this, if we were to give you the ACT and tell you you can take as much time as you want, work for a while, take a break, go do something, come back later. If we give you that kind of time with no pressure, all scores go way, way up. We know that's true. Okay, so it is a matter of intellectually kind of developing yourself for the task of the ACT, which is why most students who take the test a second time seem to do a little bit better, if for no other reason than they understand the landscape of the test. They kind of have a sense of it. I like to say it this way. The ACT is for students who know how to conserve their energy. They have a sense of it. They understand how to kind of get through passages and get through sections without expending tremendous amounts of energy, so that by the time they hit the back end of the test, they still have an ability to continue to comprehend quickly under timed conditions. There's some methodologies involved that I won't even talk about now. So for example, do you actually answer something you're not sure about, or do you kind of move on? The one key is there's two kinds of annotation. Internal annotation, external annotation. You have to be able to do internal annotation. You will mark up your book. You're allowed to write in it for a reason. They did this really interesting study where they took a look at students who wrote 30s and higher on the ACT, and all they did was look at their book. The book that was the actual book. Students that scored at 24 or lower, and they looked at their book. Students who scored lower, their book looked like nobody had looked at it. There's no markings, there's no nothing. Students that wrote higher scores, all over the page there's notes, reading. In other words, what we would call annotation. They're annotating the test book while they're working. They kind of have a sense of that. They look at the reading passages not as something to be answered, but for something to be learned from. So for example, they do the reading passage. They're not interested in answering the questions. They really want to know what the passage says. And all of a sudden, when they get to the questions, they're like, well, these are silly, easy questions. If you understand the passage, in other words. They learn the grammatical rules that most of the time are tested on the ACT. They know those rules well enough that they can immediately identify a comma splice or a run-on sentence. So they don't have to expend a lot of energy trying to figure out what is this. And that allows them to have more energy to give, especially in the math sciences. If you want a high score, that's kind of important. You want to be able to do well in the math sciences. So it's kind of a balancing act. A 36 is a perfect score. The state average in the state of Wyoming is somewhere between a 20 and a 22. For you to pick up a good Hathaway score, we're talking about a magic number of about 25. That, coupled with a GPA of a 3.5, roughly speaking, will get you your full ride Hathaway if, for example, you decide to stay in state. Tier 1 schools, and by that I mean the U.S. News and World Report every year, develops the top schools in America, and they put them out in a, you can actually see this, it's in both print media as well as online. U.S. News and World Report it's called. And their top 25 we call Tier 1 schools. Down to the second 25, 50 we call Tier 2, and then of course the rest are Tier 3. If you're interested in Tier 1 schools, you usually need to be somewhere 29 and north to start looking at a Tier 1 school, okay? Now, the reason why you're shooting for that score right there is that if you decide to stay in the state of Wyoming, you're going to pick up some pretty good monies at 29 or higher. Most of the time, most of your schooling is taken care of. If you hit 25 with a 3.5, you've got your Hathaway. Then anything beyond that starts to allow you to pick up an honor scholarships and some of those kinds of things. If you write north of a 30, you can start looking at possibly matriculating or applying to a Tier 1 school. Okay, so that's kind of the thinking in terms of the ACT. All right. Do you have any questions for me about the ACT? Everybody groovy with that? Since we're here and we're kind of talking about it, let's now talk a little bit about the MLA style book. Now, did you get a handout yesterday? Did I give you guys a handout yesterday? So let's do this real quickly. You need to pick up a handout here at the back of the room. Go ahead and grab this. And if you guys will put this inside a Schroevel and Hodges Omega file real quick. Go ahead and grab your hymnals out as well real quickly, your blue hymnals. Oh, sorry about that. Myers didn't mean to jack your bag.
That's all right.
And we'll introduce some of these concepts to you that we'll probably end up having to talk more about later. in your hymnal, if you would please, I'd like you to turn to page 1, 2, 3, 4, all right? Page 1, 2, 3, 4 in your book. You're really going to concentrate on 1235 and 1240, okay? Now go ahead and put your name on the packet that I just handed out to you. And I'm now working on the whiteboard. Now when we write a paper, academic paper, right? We do some reading from our hymnal. We then have some kind of a question. We sit down to validate that question. We're going to invent a thesis and at least 3 points of validation, POVs, topic sentences, and that we will call our essay. Now, when we're writing on our paper, we have 2 kinds of validation. The first kind of validation we will call IV, internal validation. This is language, by the way, just in 303. Internal validation. Anytime we're quoting from the book, from this hymnal, textbook, internal validation. So, for example, you're writing and you quote from By the Waters of Babylon, or you quote from There Will Come Soft Rains, or whatever. That, internal validation. And of course, we've been doing that to this point. Some of you are saying, yeah, I haven't been doing that a lot inside of my paragraphing. Right. We need to get better at that part of it. Following skeleton guide is the magic language that I usually, when I say let's follow skeleton guide, that's usually what that means, okay? Anytime we cite from a text in our book, a poem, a story, or whatever, we always want to provide the title of the text, unless it's fairly self-evident from the paragraph or the context of the paragraph. We always want to provide line numbers and parentheses, so that way we have a sense of where it came from. It's kind of almost like a respect to the reader or whatever. But there's a second kind of validation that we also are going to be working with now, and this we call EV, external validation. Internal validation from the textbook. External validation when we research and quote from outside of the textbook, from outside of the hymnal, okay? Now, how do I do that? Well, I'm going to go to the research, and the place we'll go to do that research will be at databases. Go ahead and look at the handout, that packet that I gave to you. The first 3 pages will outline the databases that I'm kind of assuming you were introduced to as freshmen. Okay? Now, if what I'm talking about here about these databases and that kind of thing you don't have any clue about, you need to get to Miss Overcast, School Media Consultant, and sit down with her. Say, Mr. McGee kind of told me a little bit about databases and doing research, and I don't know a lot about that. Most of you were introduced, though, to databases, right? Go Wild and some of that stuff last year, correct? Yeah, good. So I've just kind of helped you to learn a little bit about that in this packet, okay? There's 3 pages of that, all right? Now, when you quote, all right, what we call cite, C-I-T-E, when you cite, we have rules about the way that we do this. We have 2 different kinds of citation manuals or style books. One is called the MLA style book. The other is called the APA style book, okay? The MLA stands for Modern Language Association. APA, American Psychological, remember psychology starts with a P, American Psychological Association. We use the APA style book predominantly at the university when we're writing papers in math science. We use the MLA style book when we're predominantly writing in the humanities. So for our work here, we will use the MLA style book. Now, what does style book mean? 2 things. 1, what happens when you're quoting or citing in the body of the paper? We call that in-text citation. 2, what happens at the end of your paper on what's called a works cited page. Okay, a works cited page. Now, there's 2 ways we quote in the body of the paper. 2 ways we quote, right? Whether we're working with internal validation or external validation, there's 2 ways we quote. One way is primary, the other way is secondary. A primary quote is a word-for-word quote out of a text. Now, if I'm using word-for-word quote, how do I know that? I've got what around it? Quotation marks around, right? A secondary quote is when I simply summarize the information or paraphrase the information. I don't quote directly, but I still have to tell where that information came from. That's the rules, okay? If I cite without, or if I quote without citation, that's the P word. What's the P word that we all try and stay away from because it's a major no-no? Plagiarism, right? Plagiarism is bad. We do not want to plagiarize. That's kind of like intellectual theft, if you will. Not giving the proper attribution. To attribute simply means I tell where it comes from. In its most simple understanding, the style book for the MLA says that anytime you cite, you just need to provide in parenthetics the last name of the author. Okay, the last name of the author. Now, it might be that you use the author's last name in a sentence. You do not need to put in parentheses if you use the author's last name. But if you don't use the author's last name in the sentence and you want to say where it came from, you normally just provide the author's last name, okay, in parentheses. That last name is going to end up on a works cited page. Okay? The full citation information will end up here. We're never going to put an HTTP URL address in the body of our paper. That's just ugly and it takes up too much space. It's a distraction. We'll always put all the information right here on the works cited page. Make sense? So how can I kind of learn how to do this? I need a model. Right. That's why you have your hymnals open to 1234 and following. So starting on 1235, there's a little student paper here written. Notice capturing Julius Caesar. Go ahead and start turning through it. 1235, 1236, 1237. Notice anytime there's some citation references, they give you a little highlight, right? You'll do yourself a lot of good if you just sit down and read this through one time, and more particularly read the annotated comments on the side. But what I really want to pay attention now to is 1240. Do you see it? 1240 is a works cited page. Do you see what it looks like? Alphabetical order, last name first, ensuing lines of an entry indented. Do you see that? So that only the first line of an entry will sit completely justified left. And then we usually will double space in between the entries to just make it look clean. Got me? It's really pretty simple. Watch my whiteboard. If you're going to quote externally, now internally you do not have to put anything on the works cited page in our class. There's an understanding if you're writing from There Will Come Soft Rains, you're writing it from this book. We don't have to put the title of the hymnal on the works cited page. However, 5 times, right, in this paper that's coming up, 5 times you're going to find research on your topic and you're going to quote that in the body of your paper, but then you're going to need to list in alphabetical order, last name first, your 5 sources. So in other words, if you quote from Macmillan, I'm making this up, if you quote from Macmillan in the body of your paper, you've got to say on the works cited page where you found that Macmillan quote. That way, if I want to go and find that quote, I can run it down. I need enough information on the works cited page to kind of know how to find that. Now, to create this works cited page, we have technology that helps us do that. The technology that's most successful for us is a simple program called Noodle Tools. I think if you look at page 4 of your packet, look at that now, I think you'll see, did I say that right? I think you'll see there Noodle Tools. Now, if you have not used Noodle Tools, raise your hand. Okay, so maybe what some of you may have been introduced to it and didn't realize that's what you were being introduced to too. What I would say is you can go into Miss Overcast, you can sit down with her and say, okay, what's up with this Noodle Tools thing Mr. McGee was telling me about? Can you kind of walk me through it? Very, very simple. The one thing I would say is when you're using Noodle Tools, make sure you identify that you want the MLA style book and not the APA style book. Okay, it'll do both for you. All right? Go ahead and flip the page one more time. I've given you some information on if you're citing from the net. We obviously do that quite a bit. You'll want to pay attention to that page. Look at the next page. The next 2 pages, the rules for citing, both in text as well as at the end of your paper. See, here's the thing. When I go to the last page, page 8 of that packet, when I pick up your paper next Wednesday, the first thing I'm going to do is look at the last page of your packet. How come? How come? I'm going to be looking for a works cited page, aren't I? See, that's the first thing. If I don't see a works cited page in your packet, then I'm not giving you much over 50 points for the packet. Does that make sense? So you want to make sure that you have a works cited page. Okay? In the body of your paper then, you will quote 5 times or cite 5 times from 5 different sources outside of your hymnal. Okay, so anything that's in your hymnal will constitute that as internal validation. It does not have to appear on the works cited page. Make sense?
For our type paper, do we have to do this too?
Typed papers, no. Only on writing assessments. Typed papers are more like writing practice, we might say. Okay? Question?
So from now on, like every writing assessment we do, we have 5 external?
I like where Winters is going. That is a good suggestion. That is a good suggestion.
I'm not saying we
yeah,
should.
that is a
I'm
good
asking
suggestion.
if we should.
I think she should be teaching the class. That's such a good suggestion, right?
I think we
No,
should
that's
zone her.
no, that's right. From this point on now, we start learning how to do this research stuff. Okay. So from here on out, we're going to begin to look at databases. By the way, you might want to jot this down. Google is of very little value to you because you're searching on the open net, and the majority of what you're going to find, of course, is garbage, right? They're trying to sell you something. That's what the internet's for predominantly, right? But Google Scholar, Scholar, if you Google this Google Scholar, it will take you. It looks identical to normal Google. The only difference is the only thing that comes up there, academic sources. Almost all academic sources. It will help you a lot to try and find the kinds of resources that you're looking for, along with the database stuff as well. All right? So I've covered a bit of information. The ACT stuff, the MLA style book stuff. By the way, you want to learn how to do this MLA stuff because when you go to university, you have to write academic papers where, guess what? You will cite both internally as well as externally, right? So you got to be able to do this game. Observation. Let your textbook help you to some degree. The preparing to read page before the readings will sometimes help you. It will give you information that you can run down on the net to start to get some sense of what's going on. All right? Questions?
So then we have to have 10 quotes.
Well, right. I mean, think about it this way. And I kind of understand Carver's mathematics, right? Look at my whiteboard. This will make sense. For every one of our papers, Mr. McGee, in each POV, we have to obviously cite from internal sources, right? Right. That's true. Now, you only have 3 POVs, though, correct? So technically speaking, right? Technically speaking, only probably a quote for each POV, although you could have more. But here, we're always looking for 5. Does that make sense? Now, you can cite more than the 8 required sources. We just don't want you to cite less. Make sense? Some of you will say, wait a minute, if he's got 5 pieces of external validation, then probably that looks and sounds something like 1 per each paragraph. Well, that's one way to think about it as well. You can have 1 in the intro paragraph, 1 in the conclusion, or you can just reserve all of your quoting to the 3 body paragraphs. That's another way to do it as well. All right, any questions, comments, concerns about that? Do we all kind of know what we're doing there? Question, go.
On the works cited, do we do the internal and the external?
What I would say is on the works cited page, the only thing that's listed there, the resources that you're using for external validation.
Okay, so like internal, we just do the page
Internal
number and, like,
validation,
we
don't
were-
have to worry about it
Okay.
because it's the nature of our class that we know we're working from our hymnal. Make sense? All right, so there you go, guys. That's